Welcome to the channel, everybody. Today we've got a very special digital painting. I finished up just in time to be a little bit late for Halloween, unfortunately. This is kind of finishing up a little bit of my Halloween backlog. This is Pennywise from Grayscale to Color in Procreate. Now, before we get started, just take a moment, if you haven't done so already, go down below that video, look for that red subscribe button, click on it. And if you've already done that, try out that like button or even leave a comment below. Now, as we get into the sketching phase here, let me just point out a couple little things. This is Pennywise, the character from the It Stephen King book and movies. One of my favorite characters to draw, and even though I was a huge fan of the original Tim Burton version of this from back maybe in the 90s, I think, I have to admit the reboot, the remake, whatever you want to call it, of this, especially the actor playing that Pennywise character, really kind of appealed to me. And Pennywise, as I mentioned before, is one of my favorite characters to draw, especially around the Halloween time frame. So, you know, I have a lot of work that I do around that Halloween time. I don't always get a chance to publish it before Halloween is over, so forgive me if this is going backwards a little bit and finishing up a little bit of that Halloween backlog I have. But this is one of my favorite paintings that I've done recently, and I really wanted to take some time to talk about it, run through some of the process a little bit, and speak maybe even a little bit more to this grayscale technique that I've started to experiment with. It's not one of my favorite techniques, but it does really kind of produce an effective result in the end stage, even though it might be a little bit tedious to work with the value stage. So let's kind of break those portions down. We'll kind of walk through this step by step and kind of understand how we get from beginning to end. Now, starting with the sketch phase, I'm going to create something of a layer that's just going to be something of a throwaway a little bit later on. I use it to get my general shapes in, my general proportions in, and then from there get into a kind of secondary sketch phase where I start to really emphasize some of the detail. Now, I do this a little bit different when I'm working in these grayscale type paintings. The idea is that this second sketch, or maybe even a third one that I lay on top of it, is one that I am going to be holding on to. So when I decide that I really want to work on the intricate detail, it's with that understanding that this is something I'm going to be keeping and manipulating for the long term. I'm not going to be creating layers above it, at least not very many layers above it in the near future. This sketch layer that gets into this detail is going to be a portion of the final product. So keeping that in mind, I'm making that part of my strategy as I go along. Once I've kind of settled on the shape of the head and the sketch that I like for that, notice how I shrink it down and then I bring it into the rest of the composition by adding in the body. Now, to be honest here, this isn't something I made up off the top of my head. This composition is a photo that I found just through a basic Google search when I started looking for just some general inspiration of a Pennywise character that I wanted to draw. I went pretty literally off the photographic reference that I have. I don't necessarily have it available anymore. I just kind of found it and lost it somewhere along the way when I moved into the coloring phase. So if you want to see what the original looked like, I'm going to ask you to maybe go see if you can find it on Google, but I wasn't able to add it into the video, so I apologize for that. As I said, it was a pretty faithful reproduction of the original photo, so you'll know when you see it. And the reason for that pretty faithful reproduction is mostly just based on the idea that I really wanted to get that unusual lighting correct, because lighting a face and a body from below is just not something I have a lot of experience with, but it does create a real good creepy factor that I wanted in this particular painting. Now, real briefly, we're going into the background design. This is meant to be as simple as possible. One of our light sources is going to be from the windows behind him, and then there'll be another light source off camera that kind of, as I mentioned before, illuminates him from below. This is where we get into the next phase of our grayscale. So what I've done at this point is took the original really kind of rough sketch that I knew that I was going to be thrown away and got rid of it. Didn't need it anymore. Now that I have this more detailed drawing available to me, I'm using it with the understanding that I'm making a copy of it first. So I made a copy of this rough sketch and just kind of hide it, just in case I need to go back to it later if I make some sort of a major error or something like that. The cloned version of my rough sketch is now what I'm working on and basically just smudging all those really detailed lines that I put in there. All that intricate little cross-hatching of the little individual shadows and stuff like that is now going to be smudged to create something of a more subtle tone, or maybe a more subtle transition between tones. What I'm trying to do here is to get something that looks as three-dimensional on the page as possible without yet adding color. So what I'm really looking for is to work just kind of generally all over the piece and to create a spectrum of value. I want dark blacks, I want very, very bright whites, and I want basically all the values in the grayscale between as well. If it's not very obvious to you, I'll also mention the background that I'm working in is also gray. It's not a pure white. And because I'm working in something of a mid-tone gray as a background, that gives me the ability to kind of see my whitest whites, my blackest blacks, and be able to make that comparison between the two as I'm going through and doing this little smudge effect. Now the smudge effect is pretty easy. It's basically just using the smudge tool in Procreate set to a soft airbrush, and then by varying the size or the opacity, I create an enormous amount of control as to how much I transition between one shade or one value to another. Again, I'm using my reference photo pretty heavily for this to really give me some information about where I want those values to really sit. As I mentioned before, there is a light source coming from behind him, and we'll see that in kind of the edges of the silhouette of the figure. But there's a light source coming from beneath him, and that's going to illuminate mostly his chin and the under portions of his cheeks and eyes. There's also some of that lighting effect on his costume as well. Again, I really probably couldn't make this up off the top of my head if I tried, so the reference photo was really important here. And it really helped me inform some of the shapes that I laid in and some of the subtleties of value that I created on those big puffy sleeves as well. One of the bigger challenges here was dealing with the ruffled cuff that sits underneath of his chin and on top of his shoulders. I kind of decided early on I didn't want to sketch all that in pencil. It was going to be enormously detailed and just probably wouldn't look like right when it was all said and done. So I kind of knew that at some point or another it was going to have to be addressed, but I had this impression that I might be able to do this using some paint effects once I got my value study put in here. So I'm going to move to it, fool around a little bit, kind of come back to it later, focus on some other areas of the painting, and then eventually I'll settle into a certain kind of version of this ruffled cuff that I'm happy with. And the real trick to this I kind of ultimately found out through experimentation. I had some general lines in there that show the direction that I wanted the shadows to go, you know, from the neck outward. And then when I used my smudge tool, just on a very, very tiny setting, I was able to kind of bring the strokes out a little bit, you know, kind of start the stroke from the chin or from the neck area and pull it out and kind of swish it out there and give it almost a subtle shadow effect that made it look like these were wrinkles and little ruffles inside that little collar piece. It's not quite done in terms of the effect yet. It's something, again, I'm going to come back to a couple more times throughout the course of the painting until I'm ultimately satisfied with it and I'm done playing with it. A relatively similar effect was used on the hair. I'd sketched in some rough lines of the general direction the strands of hair were supposed to go in. But when it came time to smudge, it was really easy to kind of bring that out and kind of almost do a loose stroke and lift my hand off the screen as I got towards the end of the stroke. And in doing that, I was able to get these subtle little, almost grains or fibers that almost looked like hair. It was a pretty interesting effect. It worked out really well, and even though, again, we're only working in the grayscale so far, when we get into the coloring phase, I think you'll find that repeating this effect is actually going to really give that three-dimensional look to the hair. And it also gives it almost like a painterly texture that I think works really well also. So again, the biggest portion of this that I find tedious is this idea that I'm not working with any color at all until the very end phase of this. But as I worked through this, and as I was, you know, kind of making the final decisions on where the shadows went, and now at this point adding in some of the bright white highlights, this really started to sell itself on something that was almost three-dimensional and ready to pop off the page. And that's a pretty exciting portion of the painting if you ask me. This thing that says this is getting to look really good, and in this case getting to look really creepy too. At this roughly middle phase of the painting, I actually sent the work in progress to a good friend of mine, and his only response to this is that it was really creepy. So I think I was on the right track with this, and it really encouraged me to go forward with it and make sure that it was finished up with the amount of detail that I hopefully could add in and really kind of sell this almost photorealistic image. And that's really where I think the grayscale to color paintings really kind of get handy. If you're looking for something that's going to go a little bit more photorealistic, this is a tried but true method that really kind of helps get it if you can kind of understand how to get those values in there and get that balance of value. Again, we want that full spectrum of bright white all the way to kind of pure black and everything in between. We can see subtleties of shadow underneath a little tuft of hair on his forehead, subtleties of shadow even in his upper lip from underneath his cheek all the way to underneath of his nose. Take a look at that small little amount of gray that's added just above his chin. Even though there's a light source kind of shining on it, there is a little bit of a shadow that ends up underneath of his lower lip. The same thing can be said for the puffs underneath his sleeves. There were areas where we go really, really dark black in that shadow, and then there are other areas where it's just a really nice subtle gray and sells kind of a softness to it. Now, I'm pretty satisfied with that, so it's time to go back into our background and just lay in our basic color palette here. And the reason I'm starting with the background is because it's mostly where I like to start anyway, but because this is going to be one of the bigger light sources in this piece, I want to see the light as early as I can to help inform some of the color choices I make, even though most of my shadow and light phase in this is mostly done. And that's something of an understanding you want to go into as well. The whole purpose of the grayscale painting is to establish where your shadows and lights are. You really should be doing very little of that in your coloring phase, other than just some tweaking and final details at the very end. And that's where this gets interesting. The color here is going to go in super fast because a lot of those considerations of your shadow and light and the problem solving related to it have already been done throughout the grayscale. What makes this really interesting is that when it comes to Pennywise, there's not really a whole lot of color going on. His face is mostly a whitish gray. We could say it's mostly the same thing about his, costume that he's wearing. So we really kind of amp up that creep factor a little bit when it comes to these pops of color that come in with the orange in his hair and the red in his facial makeup. There is a little bit of color obviously added with the background as well, so I try to darken that up a little bit because I really wanted to have that pop effect and that contrast in the face to really stand out as much as possible. And again, I really think it kind of ups the creep factor. It really helps enhance some of the three-dimensionality that we're looking for in the face. And if you notice, there's also an enormous amount of texture in there as well. So again, we're trying to achieve something of a painter-like quality, and then those brush strokes really kind of shine a little bit when we use this method. Now, there's not much left to do here except for some of the tweaking. I'm deciding exactly where I want the shadows to lie. I'm deciding exactly where I want the, or how bright I want the light source to be when it comes to all this background area. So for the most part, I feel like I'm done with the figure himself, except for the eyes. I've kind of saved them for last, and it's something of a little bit of a treat that kind of goes into this. Now, I didn't mention it before, but all the way back in the beginning when I was laying out my initial sketch for this, I used the symmetry tool to help make sure that his face was symmetrical as possible. I really wanted the makeup to line up on both sides of the face evenly, same thing with the lower lip, the teeth, even the eyes. But that's where the asymmetry really kind of makes this interesting. In the movie, Bill Skarsgård, the actor, had this ability to kind of move one of his eyeballs separately from the other and make it look like one eye was staring at you and one was staring off over to the side. And again, this just amps up that creep factor a little bit, and I added the same thing into the painting. Everything else is pretty much symmetrical on his face. The eyebrows, the makeup, everything else is nice and amazing amount of symmetry. There's a certain amount of beauty there, which is what makes this character so fun to draw. But we interrupt that symmetry by those really weird looking eyeballs. And again, it's just a really intentional, kind of a creep factor that I really think really helps accentuate this piece. Now, I ultimately decided that the eyeballs weren't quite bright enough. They are supposed to be yellow, and they are mostly in shadows, so maybe the coloring and the shadowing is appropriate here in terms of value. But I did make a last-minute decision all the way towards the end and just, brighten the yellow a little bit in the final version of this. So we really won't see it until all the way at the very end, but I did kind of tweak it a little bit and kind of turn up the volume when the saturation, just a tad. So we're kind of coming to the end of the piece here, and you can kind of see where everything's finishing up. So I want to take a moment here and ask you one more time, if you haven't done so already, to hit that subscribe button, or better yet, hit the like button, leave a comment if you have any questions. I had a lot of fun with this one. I have one or two more Halloween pieces to get out before I can move into some new stuff. One last detail I'll add in here is notice we're putting the cracks in the makeup in there on the forehead. It was actually the thing that I really feel kind of made me feel like this piece was ultimately finished. So I liked it. I hope you did too. Here's a nice little scan from top to bottom. I hope it kind of creeped you out a little bit, because it certainly did me as I was doing it. Please, stop back soon. I got more coming. In the meantime, thanks for stopping by. Take care.